There's a moment, and most people have had it, even if they won't admit it, where the life you built around yourself cracks just enough to let something raw and ugly and true come bleeding through. It doesn't happen in churches. It doesn't happen in therapy offices or at the end of carefully worded conversations with people who love you. It happens in parking lots, at gas stations, on the side of a road at 2 in the afternoon when you're late for something that suddenly feels completely meaningless. It happens when something small and suffering looks up at you and doesn't ask for anything, because it doesn't know how. Elias Croft was 43 years old, worth more money than most people would see in 4 lifetimes, and utterly, completely hollow. He knew it the way you know a tooth is bad before it starts hurting, a low-level awareness that sits behind everything else, quiet and patient, waiting. He didn't stop for the donkey because he was a good man. He stopped because something in him recognized something in it. That's the part he never told anyone. That's the part that mattered. What follows is his story, and mine, because I was there, keeping the log I always keep, watching the man I thought I understood become someone I didn't recognize at all. I've never known whether that was a good thing. I'm still not sure. The weight a wallet can't lift. I keep a log. It's not a habit I advertised, and it wasn't something anyone asked me to do. It started years ago when I was working the Caldera Ranch out past Tucumcari, New Mexico, and I'd found that the days blurred together unless I wrote them down, not the big events, not the cattle counts or the payroll or the fence repairs, but the small things, the details that slipped away if you didn't catch them fast. The way a horse's ear swiveled before a storm. The particular sound a windmill made when the bearing was going. The color of light at 4:30 in the afternoon in late September, when the desert went from gold to something that didn't have a name. I carried a worn leather notebook everywhere, still do. My name is Cal Reyes, and I've been a ranch hand, a trail guide, and for the last 3 years, a logistics coordinator for a property management group that handles several large working ranches across New Mexico and southern Colorado. It's a fancier title than ranch hand. The work is essentially the same, except now I also deal with people who own the land but have never once stood in it. Elias Croft was one of those people. I met him in mid-October, on a Tuesday that started cold and turned mean by noon. He drove up to the Solano property, a 1,200-acre cattle operation outside Wagon Mound, in a truck that cost more than most people's houses. Graphite gray, new enough that the tires still had the little rubber whiskers on them, the kind of truck that had never seen an actual dirt road. He stepped out in boots that were the right brand but wrong kind, the decorative kind, the kind bought in an airport shop between flights, and he stood there looking at the land with the expression of a man trying to remember why he'd come. I was leaning against the fence post near the main gate with my notebook open, jotting the time and weather because that's what I do. I noted the truck, I noted the boots, I noted the expression. Owns it, doesn't know it. I wrote. It was a shorthand I used for absentee landowners, the ones who inherited or invested and showed up twice a year to confirm the property hadn't sunk into the earth. He wasn't rude. That surprised me a little. I'd dealt with enough wealthy landowners to develop a low-level brace for dismissiveness, the casual way some people look through you while they're talking to you. Elias Croft didn't do that. He shook my hand and looked me in the face and said, "Cal, good to meet you," like he meant it, like someone had taught him to mean it and he'd practiced enough that it had become real. "Mr. Croft," I said, "property's in good shape. Manny and his team have been solid." "Good," he looked past me toward the main pasture. "I'm not here to inspect anything." "All right," I said. "I don't actually know why I'm here." He said it the way people say things they didn't mean to say out loud, a little too fast, the vowels slightly off, like the sentence escaped before he could revise it. I wrote nothing. I just waited. "I had a meeting in Santa Fe yesterday," he said. "Then I didn't want to fly back, so I drove." He paused. "That's 3 hours in the wrong direction." "It is," I agreed. He smiled at that, a small, tired thing that didn't reach much past his mouth. "Can you show me around?" We walked the property for most of the morning. He was quieter than I expected. He asked reasonable questions, not the showy kind designed to prove knowledge, but the genuine kind that admitted ignorance. He wanted to know how the cattle were distributed across the grazing sections, and why. He wanted to know what the grass looked like before and after a drought, and how you could tell the difference if you didn't know what you were looking at. He crouched down at one point and picked up a handful of soil and let it run through his fingers. "What does that mean?" he asked. "That you're holding dirt," I said. He laughed at that, a real one, short and slightly startled. "Fair." "It means the moisture's decent," I said. "October's been good to us, you can feel it in the weight." He let the last of it fall and stood up and looked at his hand for a moment before brushing it on his jeans. Not the expensive kind of jeans. That surprised me too. Broken in, slightly faded, the kind of jeans that had been washed 200 times. I noted it. By noon we'd covered the east pasture, the main water tank, and the stretch along the creek that ran, when it ran, along the property's western edge. The creek was low but not dead, which was good. The cottonwoods along it were going gold and orange, and the light through them was doing what October light in New Mexico does, which is to make everything look like something that's already gone. We ate lunch on the tailgate of my truck, sandwiches I'd brought because I always brought extra, a habit from years of not knowing how long a workday would run. Elias accepted one without ceremony and ate it the way a person eats when they're hungry but not really tasting anything. We didn't talk much. The silence was easy enough. The desert has a way of making silence feel appropriate. "What do you do when it's bad?" he asked at one point. "Bad how?" "Drought disease, when it goes wrong." I thought about it. "You work," I said. "You do the next thing, you keep the water going, you move the cattle, you fix what's breaking. You don't think about all of it at once because all of it at once will put you on your knees." He was quiet for a moment. "What if you don't know what the next thing is?" I looked at him. He was staring at the cottonwoods, and there was something in his face that wasn't about cattle or drought. "Then you find someone who does," I said. "Or you start with the thing that's right in front of you." He nodded slowly, like it was a thing he was filing away. We drove back toward the main house around 2 o'clock, taking the county road that cuts along the edge of the property, and then out past a cluster of small buildings. An old equipment shed, a broken water tower, the kind of abandoned infrastructure that dots rural New Mexico like punctuation in a sentence nobody finished writing. I was driving. Elias was in the passenger seat, looking out the window at nothing in particular, the way people do when they're inside their own heads and the world outside is just texture. And then he said, "Stop." Not loud, not sharp. Just said it, the word dropping into the cab of the truck like something he'd been holding and finally let go. I braked. "What?" He was already reaching for the door handle. I followed his gaze and saw it. The donkey was at the edge of the road, at the base of a rusted, leaning chain-link fence that bordered what had once been someone's yard. The house behind it was empty, had been for years by the look of it, the windows boarded, the porch slumped on one side, the kind of abandonment that happens slowly and then all at once. Someone had left a cluster of trash bags near the fence, the kind of casual rural dumping that happened when the nearest transfer station was 40 minutes away. The bags were torn. Some of them had been torn by wind, some by animals. The donkey was working through them. It was small, smaller than I expected, and I'd grown up around animals my whole life. I knew the range of them. This one was young, maybe, or malnourished enough that it read as young even if it wasn't. Its ribs were visible in the way ribs shouldn't be visible, the skin too close to the bone, the outline of it wrong. Its coat was rough, the kind of rough that comes from not enough food and not enough water for long enough that the body starts pulling resources from the surface inward. Its hooves had grown out unevenly, curling at the ends, which meant no one had trimmed them in a long time. Maybe ever. It was eating trash. Not urgently, not desperately, that was the thing that caught me off guard. It was methodical, patient. It nosed through the torn bag with the careful attention of something that had learned to be thorough because thorough was how you survived. It found something, I couldn't see what, and lifted its head and chewed slowly, its jaw moving in that sideways donkey rhythm, its large, dark eyes half-lidded in the afternoon sun. And then it noticed us. It didn't startle. It just looked, raised its head fully and turned those enormous dark eyes in our direction and stood very still with a torn piece of plastic bag caught on one of its front hooves and looked at us with an expression that wasn't hope or fear or any of the things you expected. It was something quieter than all of that. It was the look of something that had stopped expecting things. Elias was out of the truck before I'd finished processing what I was seeing. He walked toward the fence with the measured gait of a man trying not to cause alarm, one hand slightly extended, not reaching, just open. A gesture I recognized from years of working with animals. I see you. I'm not fast. I'm not a threat. The donkey watched him. It didn't retreat, which surprised me. Animals that had been through enough tend to retreat. The ones that had been through everything just stood still and waited to find out what happened next because running required energy they didn't have. Elias stopped about 4 feet from the fence. They looked at each other. I don't have a better way to describe what happened in that silence than to say that something changed in Elias Croft's face that I watched happen in real time and couldn't fully interpret. It started somewhere around his jaw, a tightening, a controlled thing, the way a man's face moves when he's making himself hold still. And then it moved to his eyes, and that was harder to name. Not pity. Pity has a particular flavor, a kind of comfortable sadness that keeps the other thing at a distance. This wasn't that. This looked like recognition. I wrote nothing. For once, I just watched. "What's wrong with its hooves?" he said without looking at me. "Overgrown, nobody's tended them." I'd walked up behind him. "It's been here a while, I think. Maybe it was penned to that property originally, or it wandered." "It's eating garbage." "Yeah." "Why isn't anyone?" He stopped himself. His hand dropped. "Where's the nearest?" He stopped again. "Is there someone who?" Each question cut off before it finished. Not because he didn't know how to finish them. Because the finishes were obvious and insufficient was a particular kind of uncomfortable. "Nearest large animal vet's in Mora," I said. "That's 40 minutes. The county animal shelter doesn't really handle livestock. There are a few rescue operations, but they're small and usually full." He turned and looked at me. "So nobody does anything." "Nobody who has the resources is close enough to see it," I said. "And the people close enough to see it don't always have the resources." Something moved across his face. I wrote it down later as, "The moment a person understands that information and proximity are not the same as action." He turned back to the donkey. The donkey had gone back to the trash bag. "I have money," Elias said. It wasn't a boast. It was the most bewildered statement I'd ever heard from a man. He said it the way a person says "I have an umbrella" when they're already soaked, a bewilderment at the gap between what they possess and what that possession is worth in the current moment. "I know," I said. I could pay for." He ran a hand over his face. "What does it need right now, right this minute?" "Water," I said. "Food, the real kind, and eventually someone needs to look at those hooves." He was already walking back to the truck. I watched him open the back. He put a case of water bottles back there when we'd stopped at a gas station in the morning. Force of habit, he'd said. Always have water in the desert. And he grabbed 2 bottles and walked back to the fence and set them down just inside the gap in the chain link where a post had pulled free at the bottom. The donkey watched him. He twisted the top off one bottle and set it on its side so the water ran into the dust inside the fence line. The donkey's ears moved. It lifted its head. It took 3 slow, careful steps toward the running water and then stopped and looked at Elias again. "I'm not going to do anything," Elias said quietly. The donkey considered this. It walked to the water. I put my notebook away. Some things you shouldn't be writing while they're happening. We sat there for 40 minutes. Elias sat on the hood of my truck. I didn't object. I've had worse on that hood, and watched the donkey drink and then pick through the rest of the trash with slightly less desperation. He'd found a granola bar in his jacket pocket and crumbled it through the fence. The donkey had taken it the way animals take unexpected kindness, cautiously, then completely. I made some calls. There was a woman named Rosaria Benitez who ran a small sanctuary out past Roy. I'd dealt with her before twice, for horses that had turned up on Solano property with no clear origin. She was capable and blunt and usually operating at capacity, but she answered on the second ring and listened without interrupting as I described what we were looking at. "Donkey or burro," she said. "Donkey small, bad hooves, ribs showing." "How bad?" "Bad enough." She was quiet for a moment. "I'm full." "I know. Tell whoever you're with that I can get there tomorrow morning. If they can cover feed and farrier costs until I find placement, I'll make room." I looked at Elias. He was still on the hood, arms on his knees, looking at the donkey. He hadn't moved much in the last 20 minutes. "He'll cover it," I said. "I didn't ask, I just said it." Rosaria said, "All right." I hung up and walked over and told him. He nodded without looking at me. Then he said, "I almost didn't stop." "But you did," I said. "Why did I?" It wasn't a rhetorical question. He was genuinely asking, the way people ask when they've surprised themselves. I thought about it honestly. "I don't know," I said. "Sometimes you stop, sometimes you don't. The ones who stop don't always know why they did any more than the ones who didn't." He was quiet for a moment. The donkey had lain down near the fence carefully, the way animals lower themselves when they're tired down to the marrow, deliberate, measured, like it had learned to protect its joints. Its head was turned toward Elias. "I had a meeting yesterday," Elias said, not quite to me. "Seven-figure negotiation. I've been doing those for 20 years. I walked into that room and sat down, and I could not remember why any of it mattered." He paused. "I couldn't remember the last time I felt anything that I hadn't decided in advance to feel." I didn't say anything. "I'm not saying," he stopped. "I'm not making this about me. I know this isn't about me." "You can let it be about you a little," I said. "The donkey won't mind." He almost laughed, not quite. "Is that a ranch hand philosophy?" "It's a human philosophy," I said. "Animals don't need your meaning-making, but that doesn't mean you're not allowed to have it." The sun had dropped toward the mesa line by the time we left. Elias stood at the fence one more time before we drove away. The donkey was still lying down, its breathing visible and slow, its large ears angled toward the sound of the engine. Its dark eyes were open and watchful and entirely without accusation. He reached through the gap in the fence and laid his hand on its neck very gently, just for a moment. The donkey didn't flinch. Its ear swiveled toward his wrist, toward the warmth there. He stood like that for longer than necessary. When he pulled his hand back, he didn't say anything. He just walked to the truck and got in and looked out the window at the road ahead, and I started the engine, and we drove. I wrote one line in my notebook that evening. "He has money. He's been using it to avoid exactly the kind of feeling this cost him nothing to have." I wasn't sure if it was an observation or an indictment. In the years since I've decided it was neither. It was just true. The truest things don't need to be one or the other. That night in the small ranch office at the Solano property, Elias sat across from me at a wooden table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold and a phone that kept lighting up with messages he wasn't reading, and he said, "Tell me something about this land, something real, something I wouldn't find in any report." And I thought about it. And then I told him about the year. The aquifer dropped so fast that we lost 3 wells in 60 days and had to truck water in for 2 months. I told him about Manny, the foreman who'd been on this property for 18 years, spending 4 nights sleeping in the barn because a heifer was trying to deliver a calf breech, and he refused to lose either of them. I told him about the way the property looked after a good winter, when the grass came back and the creek ran and the cattle moved across the land in the morning light looking like something from a century ago. He listened with the specific attention of a man who had spent years in rooms where he was supposed to be talking. When I finished, he looked down at his cold coffee and said, "I think I've been buying things instead of having experiences because experiences require you to actually be present." I didn't agree or disagree. "What does that mean for tomorrow?" I asked. He thought about it for a long time. "I think it means I call Rosaria Benitez in the morning and make sure the donkey's all right," he said. "And then I figure out the next thing after that." It wasn't a revelation. It wasn't a plan. It was just the smallest possible next step spoken out loud, and I knew from years of working land and animals and men who worked land and animals that the smallest possible next step was almost always the right place to begin. I wrote it down. I write everything down. What a donkey knows that billionaires don't. Rosaria Benitez arrived at 8:47 in the morning in a truck older than most of my work relationships, and a trailer that had been repaired so many times the welds were a different color than the original metal. She climbed out without ceremony, took one look at the donkey through the fence, and said, "Yep, 2 to 3 months of serious neglect, maybe more. Those hooves haven't been done in at least a year." She was a woman in her late 50s who wore her silver hair in a single braid and had the particular efficiency of movement that comes from doing necessary things for a long time without anyone's help. She shook Elias' hand and looked him in the face without any of the deference or performance that wealthy men usually received, which I noted he seemed to visibly relax into. "You found her yesterday," she said. "Him," Elias said, "isn't it?" "Her," Rosaria said flatly. "I've been around enough of them to know she's a Jenny." Elias nodded, filing it. "I didn't know that." "Why would you?" she said, not unkindly, just practically. Getting the donkey out was not a simple operation. She was wary of the trailer, which made sense, if she'd had one bad experience in her life, and the condition of her made it clear she'd had several, and she planted her feet at the ramp with the specific donkey stubbornness that I understood completely and found somehow more honest than the way most humans decline things. She didn't kick. She didn't bite. She simply stopped, and the weight of a donkey that has decided not to move is a complete and unreasonable thing. Rosaria worked her with patience I found instructive to watch. She didn't pull, she didn't push. She stood near the donkey's head and talked to her in a low voice in Spanish that I didn't follow entirely, but caught the shape of okay, okay. Nobody's going to take anything from you, okay, just this one thing. And slowly, by degrees that took 23 minutes by my count, the donkey walked up the ramp. Elias had been standing off to the side the whole time, his arms crossed, not in the defensive way, but in the held way, the way you hold yourself when you're watching something that's working and you know that the worst thing you can do is get involved. He'd understood that immediately. I hadn't told him. He'd just read the situation and stood back, which was not nothing. When the donkey was in the trailer and Rosaria latched the gate, Elias let out a breath I wasn't sure he'd known he'd been holding. "Where will she go?" he said. "My place first," Rosaria said. "I'll have a farrier out in a day or two for the hooves. She needs a nutritional protocol. You can't just dump alfalfa into an animal that's been on nothing. You have to bring them up slow or you'll cause more damage than the starvation did." She looked at Elias with a directness that was not unkind, but was entirely without softening. "You understand that. Too much too fast is its own harm." "Yes," Elias said. Then, after a moment, "I didn't know that." "Most people don't," she said. "They think rescue is just providing the opposite of the problem. It's not. Recovery has its own logic and its own pace." She said it the way people say things that are about one thing and also about everything. I had 2 other properties to check that day, and Elias had a flight from Albuquerque at 3 o'clock that he'd already rescheduled once. We stood by the trucks after Rosaria pulled away, and I expected him to do what wealthy people usually did after an episode of unplanned emotion: file it, acknowledge it briefly, return to function. I'd watched that transition happen 100 times. The recalibration, the way a person smooths themselves back into their purpose. He didn't do it. He stood in the road and watched the trailer until it disappeared around a bend in the county route. And then he turned and looked at the fence where the donkey had been, and then at the torn trash bags still scattered on the ground inside the property line. He looked at them for a moment and then said, "Can we clean those up?" "Nobody asked us to," I said. "Nobody's going to," he said. We spent 20 minutes gathering the bags and loading them into the back of my truck. Elias did it without his jacket on, in his worn jeans and a flannel he'd had under his jacket, and he worked efficiently without being showy about it and didn't say anything while we did it. When we were done, he looked at the cleared ground. "Better," he said. "Marginally," I said. He looked at me. "Is that a ranch hand qualification?" "It's a practical one," I said. "The ground is better, but a little better matters if you're the one sleeping on it." He thought about that in a way that suggested he was thinking about more than the ground. He didn't go to the airport. He called someone. I was in my own truck. I only saw part of it through the window, him standing by his truck with his phone at his ear, and his free hand moving in the air the way people move their hands when they're renegotiating something. And then he came back and said he was staying another night. "I won't get in the way of whatever you need to do," he said. "All right," I said. "Can I just—" He seemed to be working out how to ask for something that he didn't have language for. "Can I just come along?" I looked at him. He looked back. There was something in his face that I had been trying to identify since the day before, and I finally landed on it. He was asking without expectation of yes. Not in the defeated way, not like someone who'd been told no enough times to stop hoping. Like someone who'd realized, recently, maybe just yesterday, that the things worth having were worth actually asking for. "Sure," I said. We drove out to the second property, a smaller operation, a family named Gutierrez running about 300 head, and I did what I needed to do while Elias walked the fence line slowly with his hands in his jacket pockets and his eyes on the land. He didn't bother anyone. He didn't perform curiosity. He just moved through the landscape with the tentative care of a man learning to inhabit a physical place rather than pass through it. Manny Gutierrez, not the same Manny from Solano, a different one, they were everywhere out here, found me near the barn and asked who the man walking the fence was. He owns the Solano property, I said. Manny considered this. He doesn't walk like an owner. No, I agreed. What does he walk like? I thought about it. Someone who's trying to figure out what the land is worth without using money to measure it. Manny thought about that. Then he said, and went back to what he'd been doing, which was the correct response. At lunch, we ate at a small place in Wagon Mound that served green chili stew that was genuinely restorative, the kind of food that had been made by someone who understood what bodies needed after a cold morning. Elias talked about his business. Not bragging. The opposite. He described it the way a doctor might describe a disease they'd been treating for years without fully understanding, with respect for its complexity and a kind of fatigued familiarity. He'd built a real estate development company from a small inherited stake in his late 20s. Built it right, he said, not carelessly, not exploitatively, though he said the latter with the slight hesitation of a man reconsidering a certainty. He'd grown it through the housing boom and survived the crash by being conservative when everyone around him wasn't. He had a team of 200 people. He had properties in 6 states. He had a home in Denver that he mostly didn't use and an apartment in Dallas that he used for storage. When did you last sleep in your own bed? I asked. He thought about it. March, he said. It was October. Which one? Neither really. I stayed with my sister in March. She lives in Taos. You have a sister in Taos, I said. Yes. And you drove 3 hours in the wrong direction yesterday, I said. When Taos is? An hour and a half from Santa Fe, he said. I know. He looked at his stew. She would have wanted to talk, he said. I wasn't ready to talk to someone who knew me. I thought about that for a long time before I answered. What were you ready for? I finally asked. I don't know, he said. Something that didn't have a history with me. The donkey fit that bill, I said. He smiled, small and rueful. Yeah. So did the land, I said. So did me, probably. You especially, he said. You don't treat me like I'm important. You're not important, I said. But you'd say the same thing to anyone standing at that fence, he said. Anyone watching that donkey. The things you said, they weren't about me specifically. No, I agreed, they weren't. He nodded like this was exactly what he'd needed confirmed. That's rare, he said. In my life, almost everyone's saying things to me specifically. Everything's calibrated. I can feel it every conversation, the angle. Must be exhausting, I said. It's all I know, he said. It was all I knew. He paused. I keep using past tense and I haven't actually changed anything. You don't have to have changed anything, I said. You're at lunch. He laughed at that, a real one full enough that the couple at the next table glanced over. He put his hand over his mouth for a second, almost surprised at the sound of himself. In the afternoon, I had to check on a section of fence on the eastern edge of Solano property that Manny had flagged. 100-yard stretch that had been weakening since a storm in July and needed assessment before winter. I drove out there with Elias in the passenger seat, and we walked the fence together, and I noted sections, and he handed me the staple gun when I needed it and held wire taut when I asked him to, and neither of us spoke much. He was good at the silence. Not the stiff, social discomfort kind of silence that some people carry around like a piece of furniture they don't know where to put. The useful kind. The kind that meant he wasn't filling space with himself, and that meant I could actually work. I wrote that down later too, useful silence. Knows when he's furniture and when he's a hand. At one point I was working a particularly corroded staple free from a post, and he crouched down nearby and picked up a rock and turned it in his hands and said, "Do you think she's all right?" I knew who he meant. Rosaria knows what she's doing, I said. I know, he set the rock down. I keep thinking about how she was eating trash, how long she'd been eating trash. Like, at what point does an animal decide that's the option? Is there a decision, or does it just? He stopped. That's a stupid question. It's not, I said. I got the staple free and reached for the next one. There's no decision. There's just today. Animals live in today so completely that yesterday doesn't inform their strategy. It informs their reflexes. The trauma lives in the body, not the mind the same way. He was quiet for a moment. That sounds like freedom and also like a trap. It's both, I said, depending on what today is. What do you do with yesterday? He said, if you're a person, not an animal. You carry it, I said, but you don't have to let it drive. I pulled the staple and tossed it in the bucket. Though sometimes you've been letting it drive so long you forget you have hands. He didn't say anything. The donkey didn't stop you, I said. Yesterday didn't stop you, the drive didn't stop you, you stopped yourself. Something made me, he said. Yes, I said, but you let it. By late afternoon, something had shifted in him that I couldn't precisely name but could feel in the texture of his presence. The way he held himself was different, still tired. The hollowness I'd seen when he got out of the truck on the first morning was still there. I wasn't pretending it wasn't, but there was something alongside it now that hadn't been there before. Not hope exactly, something quieter than hope. Attention, maybe. He was paying attention in a way he hadn't been when he arrived. Not to anything in particular, not performing interest or engineering a breakthrough. Just present in the specific way that required admitting that the thing in front of you was real and mattered and was not yours to control. That's a hard thing. That's actually the hardest thing. We ended up at the fence line near the empty property again toward evening, partly because my route home took me past it and partly because I think we both wanted to see it. The torn trash bags were gone. The ground was just ground. The chain-link fence stood at its slight lean, the broken post still pulled free at the bottom. Elias crouched near the gap in the fence and looked at the dirt where the donkey had stood, where the water had run and darkened the dust. She was right there, he said. She was, I said. It's nothing, he said. That's nothing, one donkey. Yes, I said. But it's something to her, he said. Presumably. He stood up and looked at the property, the empty house, the sagging porch, the silence of a place that had held a life and then let it go. Someone used to live there, he said. Probably someone ran the property, I said. Donkeys don't show up alone. He thought about that. What happened to them? Any number of things, I said. People leave, people can't hold on, the land stays. The land stays, he repeated. Always has, I said. Outlasts everything. He put his hands in his pockets and looked at the fading light on the mesa and then back at the fence and then at me. I'm going to call my sister, he said. Tomorrow or tonight. All right, I said. He seemed to be testing the statement for weight. That's the next thing, he said. It is, I said. The light went gold and then red and then that nameless color, and we drove back without talking, and it was the good kind of quiet. The kind that meant something had been said and didn't need to be said again. That evening I sat in the ranch office and wrote 2 pages in my notebook. Not about cattle, not about the property, just what I'd seen. What I'd noted about a man who had money to buy anything and had stopped for an animal that was beyond his resources to fully help, and had helped anyway, the amount that he could. I think about what Rosaria said. Too much too fast is its own harm. Recovery has its own logic and its own pace. I think she was talking about the donkey. I think she was also not. 3 weeks later, Elias Croft drove back to Wagon Mound in the same gray truck with the same graphite paint, and the same tires that now, I noticed, had lost their little rubber whiskers. He'd driven on some roads since October. I'd gone a text 2 days before, coming back Thursday, any chance you have time. I had time, I made sure of it. Not because I owed him anything, I didn't, but because I was curious, and curiosity is the thing that gets me out of bed most mornings, and has for as long as I can remember. Also, I hadn't heard how the donkey was doing, and that I actually wanted to know. He arrived at 9 in the morning at the Solano gate, where I was waiting with 2 cups of coffee from the thermos I always brought, and he got out of the truck and he looked different. Not dramatically, not in the way that a person looks after a film's third act when the music swells. Different in the small ways that matter. He'd slept. Not necessarily well or enough, but he'd slept. His eyes were clearer. The jaw tightness I'd noted in my log on the first day had receded. He was wearing boots that were still too clean for the work, but they were the same boots. He hadn't bought new ones to perform a different version of himself, which meant something. He accepted the coffee, and we stood by the gate in the thin November morning, and he said, "Rosaria sent me pictures." "How's she doing?" "The hooves are better. She's on a schedule." He took a drink of the coffee. "They named her." "Who did?" "Rosaria's grandkids, apparently. They come on weekends." He looked like he was trying to decide whether to say the next part. He said it. "They named her Miel." "Honey," I said. "Yeah," he looked at the land. "Rosaria said she's not easy. She's still suspicious of most people. Takes a long time to decide anyone's safe." "That's fair," I said, "given her history." "Rosaria says that's actually a good sign, that she hasn't just caved, that she still has the wariness." He paused. "She said animals that lose the wariness completely have usually lost something they needed." I thought about that. "There's a version of trust that's actually just exhaustion," I said. "Yes," he said, like I'd confirmed something. "That's what she said, not those words, but..." He stopped. "I've been thinking about that." "In relation to what?" He looked at me sideways. "In relation to a lot," he said. "Is that a weird thing to take from a donkey?" "No weirder than anything else you can take from anything," I said. We walked the property that morning, and Elias knew it better this time. Not in the way of expertise, he didn't pretend to expertise he didn't have, but in the way of familiarity. He recognized the cottonwoods. He recognized the water tank. He crouched at the creek, which was running a little more than it had been in October, and picked up a handful of water in both palms and looked at it and let it go. "The grass is different," he said. "Time of year," I said. "It's pulled back, conserving." "It'll come back in spring." "Most of it," I said, "the parts that have enough root." He nodded. He was quiet for a moment. "I talked to my sister," he said. "I heard you were going too," I said. "2 weeks ago," he said. "I drove up there, spent 4 days." "How was it?" "Hard," he said. "Good, both." He paused. "She's been worried about me for a long time. Apparently she'd been telling mutual friends she was worried, and everyone was just taking it in and not doing anything because I was functioning. Like functioning was the evidence that I was fine." "Functioning is a low bar," I said. "Yeah," he picked up a river stone and turned it in his fingers. "She asked me what changed, what made me call, and I told her about the donkey, and she cried, just immediately, like she'd been waiting for me to find something." He set the stone down carefully. "I don't fully understand why that was the thing that..." He stopped. "Why a donkey specifically?" I thought about it honestly before I answered. "Maybe because she wasn't asking anything of you," I said. "Not gratitude, not recognition, not the right behavior. She was just there, taking what was in front of her, surviving in whatever way she could. And you looked at that and felt something that you hadn't felt in a long time." "What did I feel?" he said, like I might know better than he did. "Responsibility that wasn't about leverage," I said. "Care without transaction." He was quiet for a long time. "Yeah," he said finally, "just that." We had lunch at the same place in Wagon Mound. Same green chili stew, same table near the window, different conversation. The first time had been cautious, him feeling out the temperature of honesty, me not knowing what to extend or withhold. This time it had the easier quality of a second read. He told me he'd been making some changes, not the dramatic kind, not the everything is different now kind that people announce and then walk back by February. Small ones. He'd hired a person to manage the Santa Fe negotiations, so he didn't have to fly down every time something needed human presence in a room. He'd spent a week in Denver in his own house, the one he mostly didn't use, and had learned, apparently, that he'd furnished it without any chairs that faced windows, which he found both funny and revealing. "So I bought a chair," he said. "That faces a window," I said. "Yes. Good chair." "Decent one," he said. "Nothing special, faces the window, that's the whole thing." I thought that was probably enough of a thing for a start. He'd also, he said, put aside a monthly amount for Rosaria's sanctuary. Not a one-time donation, a recurring one, the kind that required a regular decision to maintain or cancel, that had friction built into the stopping. "So I'd have to actively choose not to," he said. "Not just forget." "Smart," I said. She didn't ask for it, he said. I offered and she looked at me for a long time and then said, I'll believe it when it keeps coming. He smiled. I liked that. She means it, I said. She'll track it. Good, he said. I want her to. After lunch, we drove out toward the empty property on the county road. I hadn't suggested it. He asked to go there, I drove. It looked the same in November, more stripped, the grasses flatter, the empty house more clearly empty without the softer autumn light giving it warmth. The chain-link fence still leaned. The gap in it was still there. The ground inside where Miel had stood, where the water had darkened the dust, was just dry ground now, undistinguishable from the rest. Elias got out and stood at the fence. I stayed in the truck and opened my notebook. He stood there for a while, not a dramatic amount of time, just enough. Then he crouched down and looked at the ground through the gap in the fence, the scrubby patches of dead grass, the impression the fence post had left in the dirt, the ordinary particulars of a place that something small had survived in. He didn't try to make meaning out loud, he just looked. Then he stood up and turned around and looked at the mesa and the sky and the flat, cold November light over the whole of it, and then he got back in the truck. She's going to be okay, he said. Probably, I said. I'd like to meet her sometime, he said, properly when she's further along. I can ask Rosaria, I said. Not now, he said, when Miel's ready on her terms. I nodded. That was a good instinct. I noted it. We drove back to the Solano property through the late afternoon, and the light did its November thing, flatter and more honest than October, no gold sentimentality, just clear, cold illumination laying everything bare. And we didn't talk much because the silence was working again, the useful kind. At the gate, Elias pulled up beside my truck to say goodbye. He rolled down his window. Thank you, he said. I didn't do anything, I said. You stopped the truck. You were in the truck, he said. That was fair. Come back in spring, I said. The grass is something. I will, he said. He paused. The chair's good, by the way. I've been using it. What do you look at? I asked. He thought about it. Mountains, he said. Denver, whatever's there. That's enough, I said. He nodded. He drove away. I watched the truck until it reached the county road and turned north, and then I opened my notebook. I wrote for a while. Not the practical things, not the fence notes or the water readings or the schedule for next month's work. Just what I'd seen across 2 days in October and 2 days in November. A man who had moved through the world using money as insulation, and arrived at a county road in New Mexico and looked at a donkey eating trash and felt the insulation come away from something important. I wrote about Miel, her careful, suspicious eating, the way she drunk the water Elias poured with the particular attention of something that had stopped expecting and then briefly allowed itself to receive. Her wariness, the thing Rosaria said was healthy, the thing that meant she still knew the difference between trust that was earned and exhaustion that looked like trust. I wrote about what Rosaria said about recovery, about pace and logic and the way too much too fast was its own harm. I wrote about Elias' sister, who had cried immediately, who had been waiting for a sign that he'd found something, about the chair that faced a window, about the recurring donation with friction built into the stopping. I wrote about the moment at the fence, both times, when he just stood there without making it mean anything out loud, without turning the seeing into performance, without explaining what he felt to anyone. That was the thing I kept coming back to. He'd let himself feel it without explaining it. That was the work. Not the money, not the donation, not the logistics of rescue and recovery, though all of those mattered. The actual work was standing at a fence in New Mexico at 43 years old, tired in every real way, and letting an animal's patience and hunger and survival do the thing that 4 years of expensive numbness had prevented, which was simply to reach him. In March, Rosaria sent me a photograph that I kept. Elias had gone up to the sanctuary on a Sunday. I hadn't known he was going. He hadn't told me. I only heard about it later when Rosaria called about something unrelated and mentioned it in passing. He'd gone alone, apparently. Spent a few hours there, helped with some feeding, did whatever Rosaria told him to do without question or commentary. And at some point in the afternoon, Miel had walked up to him on her own. Rosaria's granddaughter had taken the picture. The angle was off. She was 9. 9-year-olds don't compose shots, and the light was flat and the framing cut off Elias' feet and most of his left arm. But what it caught was him standing in the paddock with his right hand extended, very slightly, the way I'd seen him extended at the fence in October. And Miel, smaller than she'd been, healthier, her coat finally carrying some of its natural color, her hooves corrected enough that she stood level, standing close enough to his hand that her nose was almost touching it. Not quite. She was deciding. The photograph caught the deciding. I taped it into the back of my notebook, behind the last written page. I don't know what Elias Croft did with what happened to him that October. I don't know if the chair still faces the window, or if the donation still runs, or if he went back to the meetings and the 7-figure negotiations, and found something in them that he'd lost, and then refound, or if he didn't find anything and just kept going anyway the way people do. I know he stopped. I know he stayed. I know he came back. I know a Jenny named Miel walked up to him in a paddock in March and stood close enough that he could feel her breath on his palm, and then thought about it for a while, and then didn't. I wrote that down too. She decided he wasn't safe enough yet. He stood still and let her decide. That was the most human thing I saw him do, letting something take its time with him, letting something withhold what he wanted without stepping closer, without the money, without any of the instruments he'd spent 20 years reaching for.